Where is you? And what I mean here is if we zoom into you, we can look and look, but we'll never find that bit of you that gives you your you-ness. To navigate the world, we have to think of ourselves as this unified thing. But under a microscope, this illusion quickly dissolves. It becomes clear that me is actually we. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, the president of the Berggruen Institute here in Los Angeles, and this is Futurology. The telescope is often praised as the tool that shatters our conceptions of our place in the universe. But practically, for humanity, the invention of the microscope has turned out to be a much bigger deal. It revealed that we were totally wrong about the nature of stuff itself. It revealed that places we thought were empty are actually crawling with life. And spaces we thought were solid are actually mostly space. It revealed that what we call the human body is not a sealed container, but a porous, ever-shifting colony of living things that we can't live without. We call this the microbiome, and each year the US population spends billions and billions of dollars to balance and maintain it. And maybe it's money well spent. Research suggests that we make decisions with our gut, not our mind. That the arrow of causality from our emotions, our impulses, our instincts runs from the stomach up, not the brain down. So there, in the dark and wet and warm of your personal biome, who is really in charge? Is it you or your bacteria? These are scientific questions, but they're also spiritual ones. Aminah Bradford is something you rarely come across, a microbial theologian. As a researcher at North Carolina State University, she contemplates how the tiny world we don't see manifests in the spiritual symbiosis between humanity and the divine. She spoke with Jonathan Blake, the director of the Berggruen Institute's planetary program, about how microbial science increasingly unsettles not just medicine, but the way religions consider what it means to be human. And now, Aminah Bradford and Jonathan Blake on Futurology.
Aminah, welcome.
Thanks, John.
So your work sits at the intersection of two things that I think most people would not think intersect: microbiology and theology. More specifically, kind of the rapidly growing study of the human microbiome, and then the ancient traditions of thought and practice and beliefs of Christianity. So let's just begin here. I mean, how do they intersect?
I think of myself as a theologian that lives in an ecology lab, but now also teaching. I also train Episcopal priests in theology and ethics. Sometimes I say I'm a microbial theologian. I'm thinking about the ways that the material world, especially the tiny world that we don't see, but that is massive. I mean, it's all over and all over us, are informing our spirituality, informing our evolutionary history, our tastes, our repulsions, the shape of our lives and our culture, but also the shape of the way we engage the world at a sacred level. At an interdisciplinary level, I'm working with scientists to help them think about the ways that their ecological work is going to land in religious communities. Scientists are also asking kind of questions and making discoveries that are creating paradigmatic shifts in the world. Mm-hmm. And so they're asking philosophical questions about what does it mean to be, to exist? What's the nature of being human?
Were these questions that you've been interested in since childhood? Did you feel a calling?
You know, I grew up in a pretty fundamentalist space. I grew up in a bi-religious space. My father was a Muslim from Yemen, immigrated to the United States from Yemen, a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, who wrestled a lot with faith in his own life. And my mother was kind of an evangelical, charismatic Christian living in Texas, right? So I found myself in the church a lot. I've kind of followed in my mother's path in that stream of Christianity, whilst I was deeply fascinated by creatures and by science. I was pretty discouraged, both as a woman to think along these lines, but also just that what mattered in the church that I grew up in was not matter. It was spirit. So yes, I had early curiosity about the sciences, but I was also taught that science was a threat. right? I did my 8th grade research project on why evolution was a hoax. So it was a bit squelched, but there was also goodness in that tradition. But yeah, there's a lot that I've had to shed.
How and why did you shed it?
So I'm Yemeni American. I'm a Yemeni American woman that grew up in a tradition that didn't talk about race and didn't talk about gender and didn't talk about politics and didn't talk about bodies. As a child growing up in the church in a white, I might have been the only not like super white person in that church. I didn't have the language for it. I wouldn't have said I'm feeling racially marginalized, but I would have said I don't feel good. I would have said I don't feel like I belong. I lived in a tradition that ultimately had me feeling, not always intentionally, that to be more like God and to be more holy, I had to be, frankly, less female and less brown. And the place where I found comfort and haven was with creatures.
Pets, with wild animals that
How do I
by?
make sense of this quickly? I grew up in a little Episcopal day school church, and I was one of 2 not white students in the entire school, grades like Mother's Day out through 6th grade. And so one day a year on St. Francis Day, a saint who was known to be very attentive to other than human worlds, the priest would invite students to bring like their iguanas and their Labradors, their cats, what have you, and he would bless the creatures. And honestly, that was the day that I felt comfortable at St. Francis Episcopal Day School. It was the day that I felt like, oh gosh, if there's room enough in God's world and economy for reptiles, there might be room enough for like a Yemeni American girl.
I think it will resonate with a lot of people that you found comfort, connection with dogs and maybe even iguanas, cats, birds, kind of charismatic animals, even plants, trees, walking through the forest. But how are you drawn to bacteria, to microbes?
I'm an Arab living in the United States post 9/11. Maybe it's not an accident, although it wasn't on purpose, that I've found comfort studying creatures that almost from their inception were perceived as threats. Microbiology actually teaches us that learning to live with creatures that we think of as dangerous, as pathogenic, and maybe that are, like E. coli or what have you, learning to live with that in our immune system actually makes us healthier. That living with people who look just like us actually doesn't produce good social health in the same way that it doesn't produce good biological health.
And so how does contemporary biology come to think of the individual human?
We now know that a human is an amalgam, a consortia of all kinds of microbes moving in and out, right? Which is why I'm allowed to be in a lab to ask this much more fundamental question, which is how are we going to talk about what it means to be you and me? Like, I know you're not just a pile of microbes. I know you're not. So the language that scientists are turning towards is holobiont, right? It's Lynn Margulis, evolutionary biologist, 1970s, develops this word to talk about a human isn't an organism, a single entity. We are a whole collection of lives, holobiont, but we still don't know what that really means because you're not a butterfly holobiont, you are a human holobiont. So what is that? And where are the edges and how do we define it and who's in control of it? With the microbiome, me becomes we. And who is in charge? Who is the owner of those actions? Who is the initiator? And we depend on the donations of microbes whose waste becomes the neurotransmitters that we need for our brains to work, right? So all of a sudden, some of the spiritual and theological ways that the human has thought in terms of individuality is compromised when what's inside and outside is no longer easily conceived. The other way the human has been conceived in Christianity in particular has been kind of crassly speaking, well, whatever animals aren't, whatever humans have that animals don't, that is the heart of what it means to be human. But that's how humanity and being a self and individual has been conceived. This becomes hyper rational with Descartes and hyper kind of like mental. And then the microbiome, technologies are, develop in that are about, we say about 25 years old, that allow us to start to realize how ubiquitous microbes are. They're everywhere, in, on, and around. And more traditional indigenous knowledges are all out here saying, what the heck? We've known for hundreds of years, if you're in the sciences, or for millennia, that life is far more relationally constituted. This is not a paradigm shift. And so the question becomes, what are the hidden and not so hidden traditions, often religious, that have been informing Western science for hundreds of years, that have created a resistance to acknowledging our relationality? And oftentimes they'll talk historically about the human prior to pasture or prior to modernity was thought of as very porous. We were very connected. The health of the land and the animals around us was connected to our own health, and vice versa. With modernity, there's this conversation about humans become more enclosed. But then the microbiome does something really different. It actually pulls us back to an earlier sense of the world being very porous, right? It's hard to think about separating yourself from a world that isn't safe when that world is inside of you, both good and bad. Like, microbes are in us that both predominantly are supportive of our being human, but some of them are contrary and pathogenic to our well-being, right? So what does it mean to be human in a world where being independent isn't healthy, where being, hermetically sealed off isn't safe, but also being exposed isn't safe? And so I think the real question, like the major paradigm shift that microbiology is facing now is this relational, ecological, emergent, symbiotic understanding of being human. And now we understand that actually to be human at all is to be bestial, is to be animal, is to be entwined, is to be partnering and exposed to creatures that will help us actually think and feel and desire well. So modern Christianity and the picture of what it means to be a human in light of the microbiome don't square very easily. And I think it can be done, but it won't be without difficulty, because if you look at the pandemic, you see a lot of spirit microbe conversations bubbling up that show a lot of anger and a hate even. The microbes are the creatures that a lot of people need and love to hate. So... and sometimes for good reason.
So one way all these categories have been made of historically is what's called the Great Chain of Being. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the scala natura, the scales of nature, right? I think it comes from Aristotle, but it's this idea that there is a chain or a hierarchy or a scale of goodness or value or truth in the world, that which is with the divine on top, which also happens to be more spiritual, and with that which is more weighty, more base, and we'll just use the word evil for now. And so you might see things like the divine or the angel or the kind of the noetic spirits at the top, and then you might see humans a little bit lower, and then you've got primates and on down to ultimately gnats and microbes and all sorts of beasts. This shows up in all sorts of traditions, but it's something that Christianity grappled with very early on. The very first narratives, the cosmologies of like, how does the world come to look the way it is, digested that kind of account of the world, this very hierarchical view of the world. It's deeply tragic. And it takes about 1,000 years for Christians to work this out of its system, but ultimately it ends in like a medieval agreement that in the thinker of Thomas Aquinas, that diversity exists because there's no way to see all the fullness and the beauty of God manifest in the world unless it's through a diversity of creatures. And if you look at us, we're bodies. So like to deny our animality feels pretty flat and lops off a lot of, I think, the goodness of human experience. Digestion, procreation, sleep. These are things that animals do, but we're animals, and some traditions might spiritually say that that's not seemly, or that's not like the divine. This I am whatever isn't an animal. How often we're all familiar with the injunction that we give to our 5 and 6 year olds of don't behave like an animal. In other words, we're saying, can you be a human in good working order? Yeah. And what do we know that is? Well, it's whatever, don't be a pig, don't be a sloth, don't be a snake, right? This is kind of how we've come to define in Western intellectual, Euro-Western societies, what it means to be a good developed human being. And the microbe is messing with that, I think, in very ecologically beneficial ways. But it's a paradigm shift. At NC State, we have a Global One Health Academy, where we're thinking about public health at a planetary level. And our principal investigator in our lab, Rob Dunn, has noted frequently that within the language of Global One Health, this idea that health has to be across species for health to be in any species, we often talk about health for humans will only happen once we have health for nature. And so right there already, we have this divide where humans are apart from and over and above the rest of the scales of nature. And so that really informs exactly what species are worth protecting, what species need to be conserved.
What was your own discovery of the new discoveries in microbiology like?
15, 20 years ago, I was a young mother. I was a chaplain at a university. I was a student and I was really sick. I just could not get well. It was like every bug that came through was knocking me on my face. And this is prior to the microbiome becoming popularized. But I begin to realize that the microbial profile in my own gut and my body is out of whack. And as I began to work to rebalance that diversity of microbes and life in my own body and making sure it was well and healthy, I got well. But this is before the microbiome becomes popularized. This is 2012, and a friend hands me this book called Gut and Psychology Syndrome. And it was the idea that these little creatures in your body were contributing either to your health mentally and physically or not. And I mean, I remember my partner looking at me and thinking, like, he must think I'm nuts, And then I was like, no, there's a TED Talk on it. And then I dug and found a couple of medical journal articles about microbes in the gut. Then in 2014, the NIH's Human Microbiome Project releases its first dump of data on the ubiquity of microbes in and on the human person. So this was like you remember there was the Human Genome Project, the NIH leads, and then the Human Microbiome Project was kind of like part 2. 2014, they release all this data. You start seeing public pieces in media about the fact that we're constituted by microbes, that we're made in relationship with other like non-human beings. And that became important for me in part because I was studying theology and studying about what theologians think it means to be human in the light of God. And it was all about the human and all about the human over and against animals. And I'm thinking, no, we're constituted by microanimals. So to me, there's been this tension, especially in the Abrahamic traditions, of how do we think about the value of flesh, of matter, of material things in a tradition that's supposed to be about spirit, about the divine, about the other. And so often there's like a hierarchy or a dualism that ends up oversimplifying the spirit to the good and the material to the bad, where the human gets connected to the spirit and everything else gets connected to what is not divine, what is not ultimately most holy. And microbes end up being this really interesting, quiet power throughout all of that. Because they've been in our lives forever. Just because the microscope reveals them doesn't mean they haven't been acting on our beliefs all along, creating all sorts of mysterious phenomena, right? Fermentation, putrefaction, disease, all of this has been working on us in mysterious, unknown ways. And religion has often been the tool that we've used to both explain it and tolerate it.
This misunderstanding, as you're defining it, has come through historically is in the sense of these dualities. So between nature and culture, animal and human, me and you, me in this chair, this microphone. And one critique, like in the famous essay by Lynn White Jr. from the late 60s, saying that Christianity of kind of all these traditions has been kind of really the most anthropocentric. Has put up the highest fences between self and other, nature, culture, animal, human. Yeah. How have you thought about these dualities and whether they've kind of their time is up and we need to be beyond them, or is there anything worth holding on to that you find both, I think, theologically but also scientifically?
Yes, their time is up, and yes, yes, there's something worth holding on to. I think Lynn White, I think, accurately pointed out a couple of things about Christianity that had been super disastrous for the planet. One is the way I had thought about what it means to be human as apart from nature, and he really identifies that that theological idea of humans being made in the image of God and therefore being exceptional and apart from and over against the rest of creation, and that this in some ways despiritualizes the rest of creation. The other thing he points to is the Christian notion of salvation as being this journey away from kind of being more animal and base and becoming more spiritual. And he says these are the parts about Christianity that have been so disastrous. But he turns to St. Francis and ultimately calls for thinking about a spiritual community of creatures and the value that they might bring to us, and thinking about them, I suppose, in a way as spiritual peers, which I think might not be entirely apart from some of the movements right now that we see in wanting to defend the rights of nature and thinking about them as our peers, as actual people, just not human people. A lot of thinkers have said it's time to do away with maybe the concept of being made in the image of God, with salvation, and maybe with Christianity and the divine on the whole, because of how toxic it's been. Here's all I'd say. If you go back to the heart of Christianity, they talk about God as being three in one, triune, Father, Son, Spirit, one God. And the way the earliest Greek thinkers talked about this is that this means that God is relationship. Like, God isn't a thing in the world. God is the relationship of love between Father, Son, and Spirit. It's actually described in the tradition as an interpenetrating dance of love. That's what God is, right? Between things that are other, Father, Son, and Spirit. Which means within this Christian tradition that God is the original symbiotic event. Which means if you want to image God, you're not over and against and better and apart from the rest of nature. You're gladly accepting your place, accepting the company of all kinds of creatures, rocks and stones and plants. That means to seek a way to be loving with those who are different, acknowledging that we depend upon them for our very being. And that to me is something that for this time I think is worth holding on to. Yeah.
So in that statement, you've really redefined or reconceptualized the Christian God. How does this same line of thinking lead us to reconceptualize the human, or what it means to be human?
Well, biologically, we know that we do not think, digest, develop an immune system, sleep, feel satisfied from food or hungry for the right food without this whole consortium of creatures living in on us, right? That could invoke terror and a sense of vulnerability, but could also cultivate and nurture a sense of community and connectedness and gratitude. We know that we're living in an epidemic of loneliness. If you think of humans as the only creatures worth having a relationship with, where there's mutual, reciprocal, beautiful exchange, the world can be a pretty isolating place right now. And I'm not saying that I'm not lonely ever, because I know that I'm microbially constituted. But I do think that there are ways that Christianity has been far less aligned with what, again, many indigenous traditions have understood as wisdom, which is that our lives have co-emerged and co-evolved and been co-created with all kinds of creatures, and to develop spiritual understanding for ourselves of what that means and how to be well in that world that is sometimes quite painful can create a sense of joy and well-being and goodness.
In addition to your scientific lab hat and your theologian hat, you're a farmer as well. Fancy yourself a farmer?
Yeah, I do not fancy myself a farmer. In fact, sometimes people say, "Oh, I want to come visit your homestead." I was like, "Can we call it a faux stead?" Because it just feels very experimental and haphazard.
I'm not saying you have to be fully self-sufficient, but you do work with the land.
I live quite near the city where there are a lot of other than human creatures that are visible, macrobes, but also microbes. And then as I had young kids and, a little piece of land across the street from our urban house, we started kind of guerrilla gardening it. And then neighbors joined in and it actually became sanctioned. And yeah, farming became a drug in a lot of ways. Yeah. And now we have this, I don't know, maybe it's a half acre plot. We've had up to like 60 chickens, but they all died in the pandemic and we haven't gotten back to it. Half of what we plant doesn't grow. Most of what grows where I didn't mean it to. So it was just like a really enriching thing to be able to learn to farm, garden. But also part of it was I was on this own health journey, like my own gut. And so part of the way that I thought would enhance diversity in my own body, of microbes in and on my own body, was to have my food be organic, to have it be less pesticide laden. I'm a scholar, so my work is like neck up. It's sitting in front of a screen, and a lot of work is increasingly screen-based. And so part of it is a embodied contemplative thing, right? I know that I feel better when I slow down and I'm out with my hands in the soil, touching other creatures. And I think there's something about it that's actually about inactivity, not productivity. I mean, I'm just thinking about all the gook under my nails right now. I tried to look sharp, for today, but if you look zoomed in on my hands, they do not look sharp. They look full of microbial life. But the rhythms and flows of my life with the creatures that are in the place where I live have helped me settle into experiences of stillness, of awe. I don't feel as alone when I'm out in the garden. I think of even the thorny vines as my teachers on good days or in good moments. I don't think I'd be thinking of the vines in the way that I might in an enlightened way for a second if I hadn't been practicing yoga and all kinds of mindfulness practices that are connected to the rich tradition of Buddhism, right? And to contemplative traditions. And so it's a hodgepodge. Yeah.
Of course, bread and wine are themselves the product of fermentation.
Yeah.
Walk us through, I'd say, the microbial processes that create those objects.
That moment in a Christian worship service across Christian traditions. And when I'm talking about Christianity, there's so much diversity. And so I'm always getting it wrong in some tradition. But speaking really broadly, it's the most important moment maybe in the Christian's life every week or whenever they take. Because it's that moment that Christians believe that their faith is being fed by the Spirit of God, right? It's the most material moment in worship. So here's this moment that's all about flesh and God using things like bread and wine to feed us in a spiritual way. And here it is that bread and wine, as you said, are made, they're the byproducts. They're the food that microbes have made for us, right?
How did what you just laid out for us, kind of the microbiological foundations of not just the bread and the wine, but of course our own bodies, our own, as you mentioned, our own ability to digest that food. Right, there are 300 to 500 species of microbes that live in our gut that allow us to digest bread, digest wine, and everything else, as well as immune systems, things like that. So, how does this, I guess, more modern knowledge, or really, hyper modern? I mean, these are things we're learning by the day. Is there a tension with older traditions of thought that emerged before we understood these things, Right.
So yes and no. I mean, in one sense, there's this question of what in the world do microbes and religion have to say to each other? Microbiology is a young discipline, right? It's one of the youngest of the sciences. So it in itself is a paradigm shift. It's the thing that in some ways de-enchants or desacralizes the world. All these things that we thought had to do with the interactions of the gods or the spirits with our own bodies that were making us sick or that making things ferment or what have you, turns out to be, it's not gnomes in our bellies. It's kind of like micro-gnomes in our bellies, right? So the mystery's gone, purportedly.
When most people think religion, think God, the tendency would probably be to think really big, right?
Yeah.
Universe spanning, but you think really small. Can you tell us the story of how thinking small emerged?
That's such an interesting question, because you're right. I think when we think mystery, we go big, big mysterious forces, whether it's how this all got here, whether it's good or evil force, it feels big and loomy. But it turns out, right, that a lot of that mystery is on account of something that, at least as humans, we would describe as very, very tiny, as subvisible, as microbial. So it's hard to account for how much our way of understanding and knowing and being in the world has been impacted by the microscope, by microbiological knowledge. I'm not sure that there is a greater paradigm shift than that. So, prior to the first person to witness, so far as we know, to lay eyes on a microbe, it was yeast. It was actually Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Is Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch draper, a curtain maker, and also scientist. Maybe he was you would call today a citizen scientist. He develops a tiny little microscope. I just saw a model of it at the Microbial Museum in Amsterdam. Actually, he calls them, he thinks they're waste from the process of fermentation. He doesn't think they're agents of fermentation, but he's looking at a beer sample, and he's looking at some samples from his cheek and from some pond water out on his road. So he doesn't necessarily think they're living or associate them with fermentation or with disease. That's in the 1600s. Fast forward to the late 1800s. And this is the first time, we'll say it's Pasteur, but it's a whole, consortium of scientists who, for the first time, associate a microbe as the organism or the agent of both fermentation and disease. That is the first time in history when people can understand and know and point to the cause of why bread molds or sours in a good way, why wine turns in a good way or milk turns in a good way and sours versus rots. I mean, humans have been partnering microbiologically for as long as we've been alive, but for the first time, we're understanding the gears, and they're very, very tiny. That changed everything. I mean, and that's not even to talk about Mendelian genetics, like these tiny fragments of proteins and of matter that are informing why my nose looks like my mother's nose. I mean, that was a mystery. Why some diseases seemed to pass from parent to child, or why some diseases pass from neighbor to neighbor. Spirituality and ritual develops around all of this mystery to try to control it and understand it and grieve it and resist it and celebrate it.
So it seems like you find a lot of hope in embracing mutuality, diffuseness, and symbiosis. How might we ourselves come to, take on these concepts, take on these tools to reach for a better existence?
Yeah. So my lab has been working on a fermentology project, does a lot with both. They studied sourdough bakers during the pandemic. You may have heard about the study where all sorts of people sent in their sourdough starter to a lab, and then they got a number back, and we sequenced the DNA of all of the yeast in these starters, and that was my lab. And it was really interesting that during the pandemic, in this moment of real kind of microbial pain and fear, people turned to another microbial process to find connectedness when they were so isolated. I don't want to spiritually dissect or analyze that, but I do want to lift it up as something good that happened. And yeah, especially in a moment where people were like super staying. Even I had Purell like in my car and in my purse. It was just a really awkward time. So Christians and Abrahamic traditions at large say there's one God and one creator, and that creator's good. So what do we do about the fact that there are like larvae and flies emerging from rotting grain? What's happening with creation there? Why is it degenerating and to negative effect for human flourishing? And so out of this problem, which again, we actually know was a microbiological process, which was creating a theological conundrum. Early 1400s, there's an Italian priest, Guillermo Fracastoro. He's one of the first people to identify disease with an ontological substance, like that maybe disease isn't about unhealthy relating to the divine or to alcohol or to my neighbor. Maybe disease is about an actual substance out there that isn't good. And so Guillermo Fracastoro is beginning to try to develop this theory of contagion. And interestingly enough, the word that he develops to describe whatever it must be that is that substance, he talks about that you can take your hand, you put it on a doorknob, and then somebody else comes and touches the doorknob. I mean, this is early contagion theory, right? And that there's something there that was passed. Not just a property, which is how disease was thought of before, but an actual bad substance. And he calls it fomes, a Latin word that medieval theologians used to describe the leftover effects of sin that even baptism couldn't cleanse. So the germ is immediately associated with sin, with disease. And disease, even prior to microbiology, is the primary metaphor that Christians have used to talk about sin and evil. So yeah, religion And spiritual belief, often with that deep question of, why is it hard to live here? Why is it painful? Why do we suffer? Why do we die? Why aren't things stable? And so germ theory develops and immune theory develop hand in hand, almost back to back. With germs, we discover that we're exposed. And then immune theory, we discover that that's something that we might be able to control. When humanity realizes maybe we actually can control death, and like the Surgeon Generals in this period in early microbiology are talking about we're a century away from ending death through communicable disease. Yeah. It's a really powerful religious experience for humans to have. And now we've turned again with the ubiquity, our understanding of the ubiquity of microbes, and again, our porousness and our need to be porous, to be healthy, to have all these microbes in our bodies, we're realizing we can't control it at all. And in fact, there's not only not the border of our bodies, there's not the border of nation states. Microbes don't respect encyclopedic boundaries, spiritual boundaries, epidermal boundaries, national boundaries. And diseases are not just things that we can kill by killing the rat. We can't kill the plague. That things are constantly emerging infectiously. And so here again, we have to ask, what does it mean to live in a world that we depend upon for life, but that also can make us sick?
Okay, well, we understand this. We don't need mystery more. Okay, close the doors to the church. But some of the loudest voices today in American Christianity, but also in religious movements around the world, go the other way, which is shut down the labs, right? We have our beliefs. And I think we saw a lot of this play out during the pandemic, right? I don't need a mask because God will save me. Yeah. I'm curious, what's your reaction to the, I guess the other door closing?
Religion can be exceedingly dangerous. It exists on a razor's edge because when you're talking about mystery and you're talking about possible divine power, you're one step away from crazy. And religion isn't going away. 85% of the world claims a religious tradition. Religion is right now on a fundamentalist bent. It is becoming more and more fundamentalist and extreme, intolerant of other beliefs and violent. About a third of the world claims Christianity as its tradition. And not even close to all of those Christians, perhaps including this one, are living in nonviolent ways or science-friendly ways. And so I think part of the work is to look within the thought genealogies of these traditions and ask where the seeds of this kind of violence and resistance coming from. What is it? In the third month of the pandemic, we still had archbishops in the Orthodox Church insisting on a common Eucharistic cup, that again, Christians will take wine and bread every Sunday. And during a global pandemic, the priests and bishops were insisting that it was fine for everybody to drink from the same cup because, and I quote, a germ and Jesus could never exist in the same place at the same time. A microbe and God are inherently opposed. In other words, God is antibiotic. So that was informing public health practice, right? And evangelicals, Protestants in the United States are saying, Jesus is my mask or my vaccine. The blood of Jesus is going to cover me and keep me safe from the pandemic. So of course I can worship at a megachurch on Sunday and not worry about vectoring disease. And so for me, again, to say, I'm going to step away from religious tradition and only talk to science is to miss the spot where I think theologians are more important than ever, which is to ask traditions to come home to themselves, to reform where they are anti-life, but to also to be curious and careful and to think about how do we need to reframe in light of where the planet is today. I mean, how you and I think about the planetary or the microbial is different, or about the precarity of the planet is different than the questions that a first century monk was asking in Pergamum, right? And so work needs to be done. There's something about the truth of symbiosis that isn't just a biological fact. I think it's a sacred one because it speaks to a kind of relationality that is attentive, gentle, reciprocal, vulnerable, not always easy, ambiguous, complex, but that is actually the world that we live in. So I hope where this is headed is a bit more open-handedness in a way that both pays attention to traditional knowledges and to traditional fermentation practices, to traditional ways of working with microbes. And when it comes to thinking about food crises, but also, global pandemic practices, that there would be an honest, mature acknowledgement of the fact that we do not control borders and boundaries of our bodies or of where microbes want to go. But what we can do is pay attention to the way diversity enhances health. I think it should have something to do with releasing our grips and paying attention to the flows of where life is going, trying to control a little bit less and honor and work with a little bit more.
Thanks, Aminah.
You're welcome, John.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Berggruen, Nathan Gardells, Dawn Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardells, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Migliori, and Nick Goddard.